On the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came saying, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb?" They looked up and saw that the stone had already been rolled back, and on the right they saw a young man. They were alarmed, but the man said to them, "Why do you seek the living amongst the dead?" So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement seized them, and they said nothing, for they were afraid. Today is Easter Sunday, the day when Christians around the world celebrate the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah. And as the high holy day of the Christian calendar, it does not stand alone. Yesterday was Holy Saturday, a day of ritual mourning following the remembrance of the death of Jesus on the cross on Good Friday. Maundy Thursday commemorated the Last Supper, while Palm Sunday, 1 week ago today, celebrated the triumphal arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem. And even before Holy Week, there was Lent, beginning with Ash Wednesday back in February, a time of religious and spiritual preparation for Easter. Now, when I was a child growing up in England, Lent was mainly about giving up something. I think the intention was probably to give up something that by giving it up, it made us better people. Part of it, I think, was to give up something for 40 days that we wanted to give up completely, but as it were, we needed a trial run to see if we could actually do it. There was maybe a hint in there of the origins in the ascetic practice of self-denial, abstaining from something we enjoyed, even if it wasn't actually bad for us, and that was given as the reason for eating pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday. We knew it as Pancake Day, in fact, on the basis of something about using up all the rich, fattening foods before Lent started the next day. Except that in England, Pancake Day was usually the only day of the year that we ate pancakes anyway. So it was hardly, let's enjoy these for the last time before we deny them to ourselves. It was more like, yay, we get pancakes. Now, if Unitarian Universalists have more or less figured out how to observe Easter, trying to go deeper than flowers and eggs and bunnies by focusing more on the unexpectedness of the rolled away stone, the potential of the empty tomb, the promise of rebirth and renewal following the winter of the soul, then I think it's fair to say that we're still not sure what to do with Lent. The Unitarians and the Universalists each used to publish collections of prayers and meditations for Lent, though I don't know how many of them were specifically tied in to preparing for Easter. And over the 50 years since their consolidation that formed the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Lenten manuals have evolved into more general meditation manuals, still published regularly to this day by the UUA's imprint, Skinner House Books. One way or another, though, Lent, just like Advent, is a time of waiting. And whatever it is we're waiting for, whether it's an ecstatic celebration or wonderful music or chocolate eggs, the obvious question to ask ourselves is, how do we wait? After all, it makes a difference how we wait. It's said that patience is a virtue, and that's true if for no other reason than being impatient is a good way to stress ourselves, and being stressed leads to being sick. But how we do things can change. I remember being a lot less patient in my youth, though now that I have a child of my own, I suspect that might simply have been about being young. Just the other day, my daughter asked me if she could have a piece of candy. She'd already had some that day, so I said she could have it tomorrow. 5 minutes later, she was back, asking me if it was tomorrow yet. Like everything else we do, how we do something provides us with an opportunity to be better people, to grow further toward our best selves. So let's consider how we wait, particularly in the terms of the differences between expectation and aspiration. Most of the time, expecting something isn't a big deal. We expect that the weather will be nice next week, or we expect that a book we ordered will arrive in the mail. We expect those things based on information we received, but we also know that the weather forecast isn't always reliable, that delivery tracking is only an estimate. If things don't quite work out the way we expect, well, no worries. In other ways, though, our expectations can get us into some trouble. Consider the challenge of getting somewhere we want to go in the time we have allowed for getting there. Here's what First Unitarian Church of Dallas member Jenny Weil writes about her weekly drive to church. Beyond all reason, I harry myself about arriving on time. Judgments of others come fast and furious. Your gas-guzzling SUV, your selfish double parking, your reckless distracted driving. At my worst, I'm inclined to agree with comedian George Carlin. Everyone who drives slower than I do is an idiot. Everyone who drives faster is a maniac. If I'm not careful, Weil concludes, I arrive for worship exhausted and hostile. Needless to say, that's not the way that she or anybody else wants to get to church on a Sunday morning. And once in a while, expectation not only gets us into trouble in ourselves, but can have disastrous consequences for many others too. Let me give you one example. When Unitarian Universalists talk about the Renaissance polymath Michael Servetus, we tend to focus on his rejection of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, and that's why we claim him as one of our spiritual forebears, at least on the Unitarian side. We tell the story of how, while working as a physician in France, Servetus wrote books critical of a number of Christian doctrines, attacking both Catholic and emerging Protestant churches alike. He published them under an assumed name, but he was found out and captured by the Catholic Inquisition. They convicted him of heresy and condemned him to death, but he managed to escape, so they burned him in effigy. Only then, intending to join sympathizers in Italy, Servetus inexplicably stopped in Protestant Geneva, where he was recognized, arrested, and turned over to John Calvin, the leader of Reformed Protestantism. This time, Servetus did not escape, and Calvin's council burned him alive and his books with him on a slow-burning pyre of green wood. Thus we claim Michael Servetus not only as a spiritual forebear, but as a martyr for the cause of liberal religion. Sometimes we mention other details of the story. Servetus, perhaps blinded by his own genius, fully expected that the leading theologians of the day would come around to his point of view, and when they didn't, he would resort to insults. Servetus and Calvin, for instance, had been exchanging angry letters and defaced copies of one another's books for years, making it all the more strange that Servetus would choose to stop in Geneva. We might also mention that in one of his books, in order to make a particular theological point, Servetus provided the first European description of the circulation of blood from the heart to the lungs and back, something he'd discovered as a medical student in Paris when everybody else had gone along with theories handed down from the Romans. But of course nobody knew that because his books were all burnt. Then there's the fact that Calvin had been a student in Paris as well. Now, Calvin is best known for his systematic theology, particularly as set forth in his book known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion. What became known as Calvinism, then, is characterized by such beliefs as the inherent depravity or sinfulness of human beings, and the double predestination wherein God and God alone chooses who will go to heaven and who will go to hell, with nothing whatsoever that people can do to change that either way. And if that's not enough to give you an idea of the unyielding bleakness of Calvin's philosophy, 20th century historian Will Durant described Calvin's Institutes as the most eloquent, fervent, lucid, logical, influential, and terrible work in all the literature of the religious revolution. And that's terrible in the sense of causing terror. But that wasn't Calvin's first book, and his theology hadn't always been so extreme. But to explain what happened, I need to give you some background. Calvin had been born just outside of Paris to a family that, as bibliographers Lawrence and Nancy Goldstone put it, was only one small step removed from the labouring class. Calvin's father was a notary, the first in the family's history not to work with his hands, and he served the local bishop as secretary. The bishop was also an aristocrat, and his family basically ran the town. Thanks to his father's position, then, Calvin spent a lot of time with the aristocracy, even benefiting from some of the same schooling. And yet, as the Goldstones note, Calvin was always aware of the differences between himself, a commoner, and the boys with whom he spent so much time, and yet had just happened to be born into wealth and privilege. Now, Calvin's family couldn't actually afford to send him to study in Paris, but again, his father's position made it possible. The bishop appointed young Calvin a chaplain at a local church, a position which came with a salary, and of course there was no way Calvin could actually do that, so some of that salary was used to pay somebody else to be the real chaplain, while the rest paid for school and other expenses. Thanks to that money, in fact, Calvin was able to access social circles rather more lofty than those of poorer students, and at the age of 22 was learned, ambitious, and prepared, with a large circle of influential aristocratic friends. The time had come, the Goldstones explain, for Calvin to make a name for himself. So he wrote a book. Unlike his later institutes, this book was a gentle call for reform and tolerance within the Catholic Church. And Calvin fully expected that it would make him famous within the humanist movement, then being led by Dutch priest and theologian Erasmus of Rotterdam. But that didn't happen. Far from it. As the Goldstones put it, his book bombed. Nobody bought it. Nobody talked about it. Nobody clamoured for a sequel. Rather, what everybody was clamouring for was that exciting down with the Pope, get rid of the Mass, let priests marry stuff that the Protestants were writing. There was even some inflammatory book attacking the doctrine of the Trinity itself that people were talking about. Failure was not something Calvin had experienced before. And into the city of Calvin's failure came another young man who sought out the most radical reformers he could find, and then revealed himself to be none other than the author of that infamous book attacking the Trinity, Michael Servetus. 2 years younger than Calvin, Servetus was already a famous scholar and a wanted man, someone who had travelled extensively, held a senior position at the emperor's court, been on the front lines of the revolution in both Switzerland and Germany, and was now an up-and-coming member of the reform movement in Paris at just the right time to be noticed. And so it wasn't surprising, as the Goldstones note, that Calvin hated him. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to claim that Calvin devised his awful theology simply because he was jealous of Servetus. It surely affected what happened in Geneva when Servetus showed up there at the height of Calvin's power 20 years later. And Calvin had begun his own break with Catholicism a year or two before Servetus showed up, just before his own failed book came out. But imagine, if you can, Calvin's frame of mind. He grew up amongst the privileged, knowing he was somehow less than them, and yet thanks to them he never knew failure. He fully expected to be successful as an author, as an academic, as a reformer, and yet he wasn't. For all his advantages, for all his efforts, he failed. And then arrives this heretic, someone not content with merely reforming the church, but apparently set on destroying it. And he is successful and celebrated. Where's the reason in that? Where's the justice? It's really not surprising that, believing himself so entitled, Calvin would come up with a theology that essentially blamed his woes on an all-powerful God who had already decided everything that was ever going to happen. Now, this may seem like an extreme example, but the fact is that expectation is often about ego and entitlement and leads all too easily to disappointment. None of us is very likely to craft a dehumanizing philosophy that affects the course of history, thank goodness. But we're all susceptible to thinking that reality will bend itself to our desires, to assume, like Jenny Weil, that everybody else on the road will cooperate with what we want. And when that doesn't happen, we get to our destination exhausted and hostile. What happens, though, if we can move from expectation to aspiration? What happens if we can move from demanding certain things of life to instead inviting it in? Here's what Weil says can happen once she finally pulls into the church parking lot. I gladly wait while a joyful, boisterous extended family piles out of that SUV. I watch that poor parking job as it happens, and notice that the driver is a man distracted by grief over the recent loss of his partner. A few minutes later, warmly ensconced among my church family, it's easier to recognize and release my self-absorption at being inconvenienced on the road. It isn't that there's not a conversation to be had about the environment or road safety, Weil concludes. It's that the context has shifted from alienation to interdependence. Expectation, after all, tends to be all about ourselves as individuals, a delusion that reality will bend itself to our desires. Aspiration, on the other hand, is about how we are connected to one another, a recognition that we are enfolded by the interdependent web of all existence. In the book that Joanne shared with the children this morning, this was reflected in the number of times that the wish involved more than just one person. I wish you more ups than downs, as two children go running together with a kite. I wish you more give than take, as one child gives part of an orange to the other. I wish you more we than me. And that's another difference. Expectation is passive. I expect that I'll get the presents I want. I expect that happiness will come to me. I expect that someone will love me. It's about reality owing us favours. Aspiration, in contrast, is active. I aspire to be generous to others. I aspire to make my own life meaningful. I aspire to be a loving person. Unitarian Universalist minister Forrest Church gave us another way of thinking about this. If expecting certain things to happen is wishful thinking, something that tends to be both sloppy and sentimental, then Church recommends instead thoughtful wishing and provides a list of worthy aspirations for which we might thoughtfully wish. The courage to bear up under pain, the grace to take our successes lightly, the energy to address tasks that await our doing, the meaning to be found in giving of ourselves to others, the liberation that follows when we forgive another, the comfort to be taken in opening our hearts to another, the joy to be gained even in the most common endeavour, the pleasure of one another's company, and the wonder that wells within the simple fact of our shared being. I think this difference between expectation and aspiration is the reason why Easter is preceded by the 40-odd days of Lent. Easter by itself is all too easily about expecting somebody or something to do us a favour, whether that's redemption or the rebirth of nature or a basket of chocolate eggs. Lent, on the other hand, is a time for aspiring to be somebody worthy of receiving others' gifts. If Unitarian Universalists are to do anything with Lent, perhaps it's to practice thoughtful wishing, to invite rather than to demand, to approach the future with an open heart, to encounter change and difference with joy rather than fear. And then, on an Easter Sunday like today, we can truly appreciate that in spite of our imperfections and failings, we are all nonetheless worthy of life and love. So may it be.